Good afternoon, welcome, particularly welcome back to those who were studying together with us last week, and welcome especially as well to those who are joining for the first time. So we are learning about Yom Yerushalayim and some of the questions relating to it. Last week, we looked at the questions relating to going up to the Temple Mount in 1967 and today as well. Our topic today is the Kotel. What was the future of the Kotel going to be after June 1967? And that's what we're going to look at over the period of this particular shiur and discussion. Now, you'll see hopefully at the bottom of the screen or in the comments that my colleague David Nielsen, fantastic, on cue, has put a URL here. You can download the source sheets over here if you want, and you'll be able to follow along with what's going on the shiur. And David has those as source sheets also. And if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, please do feel free to do so via the Facebook or YouTube comment streams, and I'll deal with them as best I can, given the parameters of time, etc., that we have. So let's start now. And if you are eating lunch for this Lunch and Learn, I hope you enjoy it while you watch. Now, the Yom Yerushalayim, of course, as we noted last week, took place on the 7th of June, 1967. And for the first time in at least 19 years, Jews were finally able to go and daven at the Kotel. Now, this raised a number of questions, which we're going to look at. What was the future of the Kotel going to be? As we'll see shortly when we go through the sheets, the Kotel, as it looked then, was somewhat different, at least in its expanded sense, expanded area, to what it looks like now. What would be the best way of using the Kotel? And also, how do we determine what the sanctity of the Kotel is? These were questions which were very important in those days and weeks after 1967, together with questions relating to the Temple Mount, to Har HaBayit, and we're going to look at some of the responses to these. So if you look at the first page on your sheets, you can see over here, it might be the wrong way around, but hopefully you can make it out. This is where we're going to be starting with. This is a picture of the Kotel. Now, of course, if you look at it closely, you can begin to discern some of the background to the questions we're going to look at. Was the Kotel always a shul? Were there other things that happened at the Kotel? If it was a shul, what other kinds of things happened there? Now, this picture is taken from 1870. It's one of the oldest pictures that I could find, photographs I could find of the Kotel. And of course, what you could note by looking at it is that the area in front of the Kotel itself is very, very narrow. And that's effectively how the Kotel area looked for a long time until 1967. Okay? So you'd have people coming there. The absence of a mechitza also suggests that perhaps there were no fixed prayer services, or at least it wasn't the default that there would be fixed prayer services going on. And the space, so to speak, to the west of the Kotel, that's to the left of the picture, looks at this stage to be somewhat empty. So the Kotel is there, but it seems almost a little bit forgotten about. It doesn't seem to be a place where there was a large plaza where all kinds of activities might have gone on. If you were celebrating a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah at the Kotel, there's not much space for this, let alone whether one should be making a kiddush, etc. or not, which it will come on to. So that's the first thing to think about in the history of the Kotel. What exactly did the Kotel look like in earlier times? How exactly was it used? And before we give a bit more background, you turn to the next page, page 2. Again, I hope even if it's reversing on your screens, hope you can see it nonetheless. You'll see on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side at the top, two very similar photos. Now, the one that's on the left was taken in 1917 by some British photographers called Brown and Dawson, probably after the British invasion and conquest of Palestine, as it was then from the Ottomans during the First World War. And you can see that the person to the left of the photo, who is standing there, is looking out over the Kotel, the Temple Mount, and the Kotel Plaza. And you can see that by this stage, after 1870, in the area in front of the Kotel, there's still a narrow place for people to stand, but the area is somehow built up. And looking to the photo on the right, which is taken 12 years later in 1929, you can also see from a slightly different angle. You can also see how that area was built up and how there was this small viewing point, even with a fence there for people to have a look at. So already that suggests that the area around the Kotel, so to speak, or in front of the Kotel, was initially very narrow. Buildings were put there. Obviously, those buildings were not put there under rabbinic guidance, certainly in this particular way. But the buildings were put there, and it's almost as if the Kotel was just a wall, so to speak, and there was a neighborhood of some sort which was next to it. And that area where all of those houses are today, of course, is an open space. And then if you look at picture 4 underneath, this is taken from 1938. So 9 years after the previous picture. And you can see, once again, people davening at the Kotel. You can see that there is a wall which people are sitting at the back of the Kotel. That's on the left of the photo, so they can get some shade. But again, it doesn't seem like a place where there are necessarily fixed prayers going on, and it was a narrow area. And in fact, we know that in Jerusalem at that time as well, just like today, there were some very big other large synagogues which had been built. Be they the Chorva synagogue in the Old City, which has been restored magnificently in 2010, that was completed, or the Yeshurun synagogue, which was perhaps the largest synagogue in the new part of Jerusalem, in King George Street, Jerusalem. It's still there, functions, every service taking place until today. I guess shuls in Israel gradually opening up. Hopefully those shuls will also be able to have services now in a safe and appropriate manner. So you can see that this was the area of how the Kotel looked at that time. And this tells us a little bit about the history of the Kotel. Now, in an article which I've referenced on the sheets, which I think is a very good overview of this topic, if you are interested in greater reading, by Professor F.N. Lowenberg, he looks at some of the medieval sources of people who traveled to the Kotel. There was a famous traveler called Rabbi Binyamin Mitudela. There's a street named after him in the Rechavia area of Jerusalem. And he traveled during that time to Jerusalem, and he reported as to people praying at the Kotel. Now, it's not entirely clear from what he wrote as to whether the Kotel that he's referring to, or the Western Wall, was the Western Wall a perimeter of Har HaBayit, the actual temple area itself on Temple Mount, as we looked at last week, or the area which we today call the Kotel. And the area which we today call the Kotel is most likely the retaining wall from Herod's temple rather than the actual wall of the temple. So it was a place where around the area of the temple precinct and had that sense of sanctity, but not the same sanctity as the Temple Mount, and of course the Har HaBayit. And that, of course, is, as we discussed last week, why one can go and pray at the Kotel in the ways that we do, rather than going onto Har HaBayit, onto the Temple Mount, which is, of course, far less straightforward. Now, later on in the 16th century, when, of course, the Ottomans were in charge of Jerusalem, that's when it would seem that the Kotel became a more popular place for prayer, particularly for Jews in or visiting Jerusalem. And maybe this is because there were Jews who didn't want to go up to Har HaBayit. Maybe it's because the Ottoman rulers didn't want Jews on Har HaBayit, or it could be a combination of the two. And from that point on, our focus somehow went more onto the Kotel because it became, at that point, let's say, a greater, more emphasized place of prayer because of the official decree of the Ottomans, and particularly some of the rabbinic teachings that talk about the stones of the Midrashim, talk about the stones of the Western Wall and of the temple, began to be applied in a sense, particularly in a homiletical sense, to the Kotel itself. So it would seem that at that particular point, the Kotel achieved a greater prominence, particularly because of the official recognition of it as a place of prayer, but it's not necessarily clear if there were daily prayers taking place at the Kotel at that time. Why is that significant? Because that, as we'll see later on, affects and impacts the question of whether the Kotel is a shul and whether it needs to be treated like a shul. And if it needs to be treated like a shul, what are the implications of that for the use of the Kotel and what happens there? So that's a little bit of the kind of the early history, I should say early, but the history behind the Kotel as a place of prayer, and perhaps shed some light on why there was a small area which was open in front of the Kotel, perhaps because either it wasn't used that regularly in the same way as we do today for bread, regularly but not perhaps as regularly, but also because they may well have been, particularly from some of the Ottoman rulers, objections to too many Jews praying in that area. Just for the comment that came in about the handout, it's available on the in the URL underneath, hopefully underneath the posting on Facebook and on YouTube. And thanks, David, for putting it back on the screen as well. Be able to download it and look at it from there. So far, we've seen that the Kotel is a place that has a lot of history, but the history needs to tell us about the sanctity of the place as well. Was it a shul? Was it a place of learning, perhaps, as one can also see in some of the photos, or was it something else? Now, going back to page 2 in our handout, over here, we can see another photo of the Kotel. This takes us forward to 1967. And you can see here on the left-hand side, a picture from the Israeli Defense Ministry of some soldiers at the Kotel shortly after the first Yom Yerushalayim. And this is taken, of course, from the northern side. And you can see from above what it looked like, a kind of bird's eye view down onto the Kotel. And this again shows you just how cramped that particular area was and how close some of the buildings were to the Kotel. You can probably get about 4, maybe 5 soldiers standing in a line from the Kotel to linking to their houses. And with, as we discussed last week, the enormous numbers of people who wanted to come to the Kotel, especially after 1967, this area just wouldn't work, especially if people wanted to use the Kotel on a more regular basis and wanted to turn it into a place of prayer, again, as we will see. And just to note that this coming Shabbat, of course, is the day after Yom Yerushalayim. Yom Yerushalayim is Thursday night and Friday. Do look out for the next Mizrahi UK and United Synagogue Shabbaton at Home program, which will start on Friday night before Shabbat starts, with concerts, with singers, songs about Yerushalayim, speeches from the chief rabbi and Israeli ambassador Mark Regev, and have a whole pack for you to print out to use at home on Shabbat, with many themes, stories, quizzes, and other fun things to do for Yom Yerushalayim. So do look on our social media here, on the US social media, and also on the Mizrahi UK social media as well for further details tomorrow and Friday as well. Now, moving to the right of the page, the final picture at the bottom right-hand corner is also one, of course, from the Six-Day War. And here you can see, as Rabbi Goren is the Rav of the IDF, the chief rabbi of the army at that time, holding a Sefer Torah, and you can see many soldiers crowded in, okay? And they were dancing and singing. Prayers, as we discussed last week, did take place on that first Yom Yerushalayim by the Kotel. You can see the dancing and singing, and what a crowded place it was. But evidently this meant decisions would need to be taken sooner rather than later to try and work out what the future of the Kotel would be. Was it to be turned, as it had been previously, into a place of prayer, but perhaps on a much bigger and more regular scale than it had been previously? Was it to be turned into, instead, a place which was almost a national shrine that people would look at in a very respectful way, perhaps wouldn't go too close to it? Or was it going to become, in a sense, an alternative to going on the Temple Mount? We'll look at, all being well, time permitting, all of these questions as we move forward. Now, if you turn to the next page, to page 3, over here. Now, this picture at the top is what happened shortly after the Six-Day War. You can see now the broad expanse of the plaza, which we today know as the plaza in front of the Kotel, the Rachavat HaKotel. The houses which were there, which were effectively become slum housing, very, very sadly, were knocked down. The inhabitants were given new accommodation in the Shuafat area of Jerusalem. And the Kotel area it's a kind of, in a kind of compulsory purchase sense. The Kotel area became wide open so that once again it became a national place of gathering. There's a beautiful story I can't help but want to share, which I heard in Kinlos, where I work as one of the assistant rabbis, as well as my job in the United Synagogue education team, where we heard at a joint event with the Zionist Federation from one of the 3 paratroopers in the famous photo of the paratroopers at the Kotel in 1967, Dr. Yitzhak Ifat. And Dr. Ifat became a well-known doctor in Israel afterwards, and one of the stories he shared quite remarkably when someone said to him was, how did you feel at that moment when the photo was being taken? And he said it was kind of difficult to remember or to know because they just heard some crying from one of the houses. And it turned out that there was a woman who was going into labor with a baby, and Dr. Ifat, who was a medic at the time, and the other medics ran as fast as they could to find the house and help deliver the baby at that time. And so he said his main thought focus was on, wow, there's a baby here. We've got to try and get it delivered safely. We've got to try and help the mother. And so he said for him, in I think, a very beautiful way, which shows the midot, the characteristics which Jews need to have. We might have just come back in the middle of a war with everything that was going on to a place of great national importance and sanctity, but something needed to be done, looking after that baby and the mother, and that's what was done at that particular moment. So shortly after the 6-Day War, the area of the Kotel Plaza was made, as we are familiar with it in some ways today. And of course, the question that we need to look at is looking at this photo is, how is that different from today? One of the important differences, as we'll see in a photo coming up, and you're familiar with if you've been to the Kotel, is the lack of a barrier separating between the prayer area, if I can call it, in front of the Kotel, and the courtyard which comes, or the plaza which comes behind it. And we'll come back to that shortly as well, just noting it now. The next picture down on the page is one which is difficult to get into exact focus, but in the middle you might recognize Menachem Begin. Of course, in 1977, in a very surprise election victory, became the Prime Minister of Israel, the first time that the Labour Party in Israel had lost power. Menachem Begin, who was a very traditional Jew, went to the Kotel to daven. Menachem Begin wasn't just a Jew who knew the Kotel as a national shrine. He was somebody who, having grown up in Warsaw, was very traditional, always kept laws of kashrut and Shabbat, for instance, in public when he was the prime minister, whatever he may or may not have done at home, and also knew how to daven. In fact, Yehuda Avner, who I think we mentioned last week, in his memoirs, the prime minister, describes going into shul with Menachem Begin on Rosh Hashanah in the great synagogue in Jerusalem, and hearing how Begin would daven in a very soulful way with the tunes and the pronunciation of his youth in Warsaw. As he enveloped himself in the Rosh Hashanah davening. Then here, after his election victory, Menachem Begin went to the Kotel to daven, and you can see, surrounded by people, surrounded by media, which of course is not the ideal. The media certainly is not the ideal for a moment of quiet prayer in a shul or somewhere else. But this is what happens to the Kotel. And is this going to be permissible as well? If the Kotel is a shul, can you make it into an events place as well? These are questions which, again, time permitting, we'll come back to shortly. Now, the final picture on this page, the one at the bottom, is a picture which hopefully you've got in color on your screens. It's a beautiful picture relating to about a tekes hashba'ah, about a swearing-in ceremony for soldiers, many of which take place in the plaza behind the Kotel prayer area. And you may have seen it. It's very moving. You see soldiers having their swearing-in ceremony, receiving their Tanakh, their Hebrew Bible, or for non-Jewish soldiers receiving something equivalent. And these ceremonies are done specifically at the Kotel, not just because of its religious history, but also its military history and significance for the state of Israel as well. And the question that needs to be asked is the Kotel Plaza the right place to have what is effectively a secular swearing-in ceremony? Of course, it's very meaningful, it's very emotional, but it's not a religious ceremony per se. Is it the kind of thing you would have in a shul instead or not? So these are some of the ways the Kotel is used. These are some of the questions which arise, and we're going to look at how to address them. Now, just for now, two more photos. The first one, which we looked at last week, but just to show you again, that's about the second temple as it would look today. And the reason I've included this one, which is courtesy of Machon HaMikdash in the old city of Jerusalem, and by my colleague Rabbi Josh Flug in the Center for the Jewish Future at Yeshiva University in New York. You can see on this photo, just to review it from what we did last week, how the second temple would look if it was placed today on the way that the Temple Mount, Har HaBayit, and the Kotel look as well. And in the bottom of the left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner of the picture, numbers 2 and 5, particularly number 2, you can see the where the number 1, you can see where the Western Wall Plaza and the Kotel itself are. So those areas we're familiar with today are very, very small in comparison to the rest of the particular area. And also you can see how far back they are from the Temple Mount area. If looking at the diagram in the middle, you could see where the Western Wall, referring to what Rabbi Yamin Mitzudela said in his, when we referenced earlier in his travels, there's obviously a big difference between the Western Wall of the temple and even the Har Habayit area. Let's say, even just for illustrative purposes, that it's that outer Western Wall of Har Habayit might be on the western side of that particular the open space on the Temple Mount. That's some distance as well from where the Kotel is today. And does that impact on the sanctity of the area which we know as the Kotel? So we'll come back to answer these questions shortly. Finally, on this page, we'll look at the bottom photo at the bottom, which is taken on a snowy day. Just seeing the Kotel as a quiet place. And you can see in the photo where the barrier is at the back of the prayer part of the Kotel, and also the big expanse of the Kotel Plaza and how that can be used either for chairs for events, seating events, or for an IDS swearing-in ceremony, or concerts or other things which take place, but is also occasionally, of course, used for prayer as well. If you've been to the Kotel for first night Slichot, for instance, or on Yom Yerushalayim, the whole area is just absolutely packed out. It's incredible, and it's far beyond where the mechitza, the barrier, is at the back of the Kotel area. This picture reminds me of a beautiful story, actually, the chief rabbi has told on a number of occasions when he lived in the Old City. I'll just mention it briefly. I'm sure you can hear the full details from him another time. But when he lived in the Old City shortly after he got married, the Kotel became his shul. And there was a tradition still maintained that the Kotel should be somehow attended every moment, that if at all possible, someone should be there. And on a snowy day in the Old City, the chief rabbi went to daven at the Kotel, and after a while when he was davening there, there'd only been one other person, that other person left. And suddenly the chief rabbi said that he felt the sense of he's representing Am Yisrael. On this snowy day at the Kotel, everything was quiet, everything was pristine. Thinking the references in Psalms, as we say in our davening in the morning, that snow is like wool, which is beautiful and embroidered and makes things look very wonderful. He felt this sense of history, but also of obligation of being at the Kotel. When I look at this picture, I think of that story because I find it very moving. To be the person who was representing Am Yisrael at the Kotel is a very remarkable thing. So just to review what we've seen so far, we've seen a little bit about the history of the Kotel, when it was used for prayer at various times, how that came about in a more official terms rather than just in more informal terms, how even there was governmental sanction to prayer there, not just individual Jews going to pray there at various times. We've seen how the area around the Kotel has changed over history and how that has affected its use. Having greater space has affected its use as well. And we'll examine that and what the implications are on the next page. Just a reminder, if anybody has any other comments, thoughts, questions, do feel free to put them into the comments box on Facebook or on YouTube, and I'll do my best to come to them if we have time, especially now that we've been through all the photos. So if you turn to the next page, which is page 5, over here, I want to look briefly at some of the factors in halakha which we need to consider when analyzing the Kotel today. And the top two sources, which are in Hebrew, but I will read and translate, so don't worry if you're not a fluent Hebrew reader or speaker, they give us a little bit of background. And these are both sources in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in the volume called Megillah, which at the beginning certainly deals with questions relating to Purim, as you'd expect from the name, but in the final chapter looks particularly at questions relating to synagogues, their sanctity, what you can do with synagogues as well. And just thinking about our synagogues, they are not just places, often, not always, but often they're not just places with a sanctuary dedicated for prayer, but they have other rooms attached to them and other purposes as well. And even in some synagogues which have a dedicated sanctuary for prayer, that synagogue or that dedicated sanctuary is a multi-purpose room. In Kinlos, we have a a wonderful hall, the Nissan and Rivka Deal Hall, which is used on Friday night and Shabbat for services, but also, and this is how it was scoped out when it was set up, these were the conditions on which it was set up, also used for other activities during the week, which have nothing to do with the shul. Pina Shul is another good example of this as well. And there are many, many others. So the Gemara here looks at this particular question, and I'll start reading the first source, I'll read and translate, and we'll see how we tease out some of the questions and factors which arise. So the Gemara here is commenting on a law or a case in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first part of the Talmud, one of the earliest statements of Jewish law, and the Gemara, which comes after it, explains the Mishnah, asks questions on it, and is a kind of discussion. Imagine rabbis metaphorically sitting around the table discussing points of law, a bit like judges might do in the Supreme Court or elsewhere, and bringing proofs, bringing questions, refining what they think are the points and the principles of the law at hand. So the Gemara says as follows: if there are people who are, let's say, in some form of authority in a particular place, okay, who have sold the plaza of the city. So you have public space. This is almost a public law issue as well. Public space, but it gets sold to somebody. Okay, how can this happen? What are the implications? What are the responsibilities for selling public space? So the first view offered is Amar Rava Bar Bachana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Bachana and Amora, one of the later sages, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who lived earlier than him, Zotivrei Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi Stumata. Aval Chachamim Omrim Rechovash Ein Bo Mishum Kedusha. So the first view says that, well, there is a view that says that actually this particular place has a certain sanctity to it, a public square, let's call it. Whereas the second view, that of the majority of sages, is that the public square does not have any sanctity to it. How could a public square that have sanctity to it? Does Trafalgar Square have sanctity? Does the Iyar, the plaza in the municipal building in a municipal town hall in Jerusalem, have sanctity to it per se? What's the underlying this particular question over here? So the Gemara then answers in the continuation, for Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi my tame. What therefore is the reason behind the first view of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi, who says, or implies at least, that there is some sanctity to a town square. End of the second line, beginning of the third line. Since people come and pray there, b'ta'aniyot of ma'amadot, on fast days and when there are specific special circumstances and ceremonies, that's the reason that they have sanctity. And of course, this is what happens at the Kotel on occasion as well. If, God forbid, there is a drought in Israel during the winter times, there are a series of prayers to say. There are a series of fast days to have, all detailed in the Mishnah, in the volume of Ta'anit, which of course deals with fasts and other related matters. And on such years, there's been massive prayer services at the Kotel. A little bit like we said, the massive prayer services in terms of numbers of people on first night of Slichot, and other times during Slichot, and on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim as well. So this view says that if people come even on an occasional basis and pray in such a place, it gives it a sense of sanctity, perhaps a bit like a shul. Maybe not exactly, but a bit like a shul. And the rabbis say in the final words in the third line of this section, V'Rabbanan, their reply is, Ahu akrai ba'alma. Since this is just very occasional, it's not on a fixed basis, it doesn't have sanctity. And this has big implications. What about now in our current circumstance? If we are able to restart communal prayer, we might have to do it outside. Let's say it'll be in an outside area in a synagogue complex, or let's say that it's going to be in a public area somehow in a way that's safe and appropriate. Does having prayers there, does that give that place a sense of sanctity that you can't do other things there? You couldn't bring a football and have socially distanced, safe football training or passing, let's say, after the prayers have taken place. For instance, that question would be addressed in part by the principles in this particular part of the Talmud. So, looking at the area around the Kotel, in front of the Kotel, we see there is a dispute based on this piece of the Talmud as to whether it has sanctity or not. Now, this depends whether people are praying in it on a fixed basis or not. And of course, the history of the Kotel, we're not sure on how much of a fixed basis people were able to pray there, or it was just when people had the opportunity and somehow took it whenever they could. And we're also not sure what exactly is the area, at least from this source, that would be sanctified. Is it the area where people would pray in because that's been designated as a prayer area? Or is it just wherever people be in view of the kotel? And they can see the kotel where they are. We'll come back shortly to try and answer these questions. Now, thinking about what else we can do in the kotel area, especially given the way that we use shuls today, if the kotel is to be treated like a shul. As I mentioned, and we're familiar with, we use our shuls in all kinds of ways. But using the actual sanctuary, unless it's been, as I referred to before, set up, as in Pinor or in the deal hall in Kinloss, unless it's been set up with a specific condition in mind that it's not just being used as a shul, it's not straightforward necessarily to say that you can use a shul for a non-sanctified purpose, for showing a film, for instance, for having eating and drinking in it. And that's exactly, not the film, the eating and drinking is the example we see in the next Talmudic excerpt, which is the second Hebrew citation on your page. And once again, this is from the same volume of the Talmud, from Megillah. This time it's page 28a. So Tanu Rabbana, the rabbis taught, Batei Chanesiot, synagogues, what's the rule with them? What principles do we need to put into place? Ein nohagin bahen kalut rosh. You can't have kalut rosh. Kalut rosh means lightheadedness. Okay? It means not behaving in a proper way. Okay? It might mean, for instance, sleeping in them. That can be quite difficult in certain times. I can understand. So say always the rabbi's dilemma: is it good to put people to sleep and give them a rest or not? But also, of course, we know that in olden times, sometimes, particularly on Friday nights, shuls were the place where people had to stay if there were no lodgings available for them anywhere else, visitors who were passing through. And we also know that they would make kiddush in shul. Kiddush be made in shul on behalf of such visitors. One of the reasons that our practice is to make kiddush in shul today. Certainly when I say our practice, for those watching outside of the UK, it might not be your practice, but certainly in the United Synagogue in the UK, it's we follow that custom of making kiddush still in shul on Friday nights, based on how in the olden times it was made for visitors and travelers in the shul, even though of course everybody should make kiddush at home when they eat supper there. So Kala Rosh could mean that. It could mean a form of messing about. It could mean inappropriate conversations which are not sanctified ones, talking about everyday mundane things, etc. It could also mean, as the Gemara says, you can't eat or drink in them. You can't have the kiddush in the shul, so to speak. Perhaps you can't even have a l'chaim in the shul if that hasn't been set up, at least with that that condition in mind, as I mentioned before, with shuls like Pinner or the deal hall at Kinloss. So we already begin to see ways of the way the kotel can be used. Is it appropriate to have a celebration close to the kotel, or should it be behind the barrier where the prayer area ends? Is that one of the reasons that the barrier was put in place? What way should we behave at the kotel? The ways that we dress, the ways that we conduct ourselves. If it's like a shul, because it's become like that, particularly because the way we've been davening there, even if it wasn't one of the original walls of the Second Temple, it nonetheless has been given sanctity by dint of being used as a shul, as well as being our last remnant of the Second Temple. What's the right way to act there? And I've said for bar and bar mitzvahs, this has some important resonance. Rabbi Shlomo Goren, what we mentioned before, tells in his autobiography, which we talked about last week, With Strength and Might, published by Maggid Books, a really wonderful read in trying to understand more about the early years of the State of Israel and some of the real questions which rabbis had to deal with, which had not been dealt with in a Jewish state context or a Jewish governing context for hundreds and hundreds of years. Rabbi Goren notes that the first Shabbat at the Kotel, he managed to bring a few cakes before Shabbat to have in an appropriate place so that everyone could make Kiddush if they managed to daven there. This is on the last day of the 6-day war. Yom Yerushalayim was on the Wednesday, the third day, and the last day was Shabbat. And at that stage, the Kotel didn't look as we've seen, or the areas around the Kotel didn't look as they look today. So if the Kotel was being used as a place of prayer on a fixed basis after that, would that impact on the eating or drinking that might take place? So that's the second thing the Talmud tells us. So we have to think about, number one, what's the sanctity of the place? Is it like the sanctity of a shul? And number two, what does that mean? in the way that we behave there, and how does that apply to the area around the Kotel? And just to give one of the derivations of Jewish law from this, the final citation in Hebrew, about a third of the way down the page, so just over here. That's from the Rambam Maimonides, the great medieval scholar, doctor, philosopher, who wrote his Mishneh Torah, very important work, remains enduring important work of Jewish law, and in this case, source for the Shulchan Aruch, the main code of Jewish law, published in the 16th century by Rabbi Yosef Karo of Sfat. And the Rambam Maimonides, Rambam being an acronym for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, says as follows. I'll read and translate the Hebrew for you. Rechova shel ir, the town square. Even though people on fast days and certain special occasions will gather there to pray because there's so many people, and the shuls cannot contain them. They do not have sanctification because they're only used on an occasional basis for prayer. They're not fixed as a place for prayer. So the Rambam understands, like the view of the majority of scholars in the first passage we saw above. That's because a town square is only used occasionally. It's not fixed for prayer. It doesn't have sanctification. Therefore, you can use it for things which you can't do in a non-sanctified place. And he also says, the Rambam continues in the middle of the second line, similarly, houses and courtyards which people gather in to pray. Ein bahem kedusha, they do not have the sanctity of a shul, mipnei shelo kavu otam litzfilah bilvad, ela aray mitpalalim bahem. They don't have the sanctity of a place which has been fixed for prayer because people only pray there on an occasional basis. It's a bit like someone who davens at home. Again, very relevant, unfortunately, to our circumstance at the moment. If you daven at home in your kitchen table, or if you're lucky enough to have a dining room table, at your dining room table, the fact that that becomes your place of prayer because you can't go to shul, or becomes your place of prayer generally speaking because you for whatever reasons you don't go to shul, you're unable to get to shul, unfortunately, that place does not become sanctified as a place of prayer according to this, because you haven't intended it to be so. It's your kitchen, it's your dining room, we do all kinds of things. One of them is prayer. And similarly, if we are to start davening, should things please God improve, continue to improve in terms of the situation, then with coronavirus and we're davening outside in small groups, those places outside will not get, according to the Rambam here, the sanctity of a shul, because we're not fixing them as a place for prayer, and we are not making them a place which is sanctified. They are places where we do all kinds of things, one of which is prayer. So a very important practical lesson. And of course, this question also was one which was confronted in 1967 and subsequently about the Kotel, especially once the Kotel Plaza was enlarged. Is it going to be fixed as a shul, or is it going to be fixed as something else? What was going to happen for the Kotel? And in a sense, you might say that the people decided, because when you go to the Kotel today, or you look at the Kotel today, those who are fortunate enough to go can experience it. It's become a place of round-the-clock prayer, and referred to in the story told by the chief rabbi earlier on. And in a sense, we being the Jewish people, have decided what to do with the Kotel and its sanctity. But before we close, I want to look at the writings of the person who I suppose is most responsible for what to do at the Kotel. And if you look at the bottom part of page 5, see the picture over here, the rabbi on the left of the picture, wearing the black hat, shaking hands with Ambassador David Friedman. That's U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. That rabbi is Rabbi Shmuel Rabinovich, who is the rabbi of the Kotel. The rabbi in the middle in the ceremonial rows was at the time, is the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi Shlomo Moshe Amar, former Sephardi chief rabbi Rishon LeZion of Israel as well. Now, Rabbi Rabinovich is the rabbi of the Kotel. He was officially appointed to that position because the Israeli government and the Israeli rabbinate, chief rabbinate, understood that the Kotel, like every other shul, needs to be looked after. If you don't have people who are organizing things in the shul, taking care of things in the shul, looking after the standards of the shul, then things are not going to function properly. It needs to be organized. It needs to be looked after correctly. And Rabbi Rabinovich is the rabbi of the Kotel and some other holy places in the state of Israel as well. And he has addressed many questions relating to the Kotel, the customs and the practice and the history of the Kotel. Answers rather, relating to specific questions he's been asked about the Kotel, the genre of Jewish scholarship called She'elot Tshuvot, questions which people often write in, as we discussed last week with reference to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in particular, former chief rabbi of Israel, and his radio show where people call up with questions and he would give the answers using encyclopedic knowledge and they'd be written down afterwards. But people write in or call in with questions, and then the rabbi writes a halachic opinion, a legal opinion, effectively, answering that particular question. So Rabbi Rabinovich wrote a very instructive article about how to treat the sanctity of the Kotel today in an important periodical called Techumin. This is volume 36 from 2016, published by Machon Somet in Alon Shvut in Gush Etzion in Israel. And each year, Techumin features, published on an annual basis, it features articles looking at contemporary Jewish questions, be they questions of halakha, be they questions relating to our understanding of the Tanakh, and from a whole variety of perspectives of Israel, the perspectives of society, philosophical questions, economic questions, and how we apply the halakha to the context and the questions which we are dealing with. So Rabbi Rabinovich looks at a particular question of eating and drinking at the Kotel and in relation to its sanctity as a shul. And he notes that, I'll summarize his conclusions. He notes that eating and drinking in a shul, as we saw indicated from the first Talmudic citation, the second one, is prohibited. Unless it's a su'udat mitzvah, unless it's a su'udah, which is you're fulfilling a mitzvah in it. What might that be? If there's no other place, for instance, to make kiddush, but you can only do it in a shul, so that's a su'udat mitzvah, seen because it's a mitzvah to make kiddush. It's not that someone is deciding, I'm just going to sit down in the shul and use it as a place for having my lunch. On the other hand, if a place is a bet midrash, a place of learning, the halacha is that you can eat and drink if it's your fixed place of being. If you're in the bet midrash most of the day or certain hours, particularly, and it would harm your learning to have to go somewhere else, so you can have a snack or something to drink in there as well. And you'll see in yeshivot and midrashot in seminaries, you'll see how often people will be drinking tea or coffee, in my case particularly coffee, and also having snacks to keep them going while they're studying. So Rabbi Rabinovich suggests that you could only have eating or drinking in such a place if it's for a su'udat mitzvah. And he notes you have to avoid any attendant kalut rosh, any inappropriate behavior which isn't treating the sanctity of the kotel appropriately. He applies this specifically to the kotel. And one of the reasons perhaps why there is the barrier, the back of the kotel from the greater area which is behind it. And he notes that such eating and drinking or other forms of ceremonies, you can see, for instance, in the picture, this was at Hanukkah time, and there would have been lots of people coming for Hanukkah candles and photography and all kinds of and filming and all kinds of other things taking place. He notes that this only works if you have the kind of the non-mitzvah specific bits, if it's for a tzorech rabim, if you're doing it for a great public need from time to time, and there is a mitzvah involved in it somehow. So therefore, in terms of the kotel, we have to treat it, says Rabbi Rabinovich, a bit like it's a shul. We have to treat it a bit like it is like it's a shul. And the area behind the barrier at the back of the kotel prayer area, that's the place for other things, be it for ceremonies for swearing in, be it for any other ceremonies that are taking place. But towards the area of the kotel, the prayer area has been dedicated now, post-1967, as effectively one big shul. And he notes that one should not eat or drink in that area. He also says that we have to keep it clean and tidy, so avoiding eating and drinking is an important part of that. And he also says, very tellingly, that the kotel, of course, doesn't just have Jewish visitors, it has visitors from all different religions around the world. And he says we have to make sure, as Jewish people, that we are showing that the kotel is well looked after and is treated respectfully. And it shouldn't be a place where people seem to be hanging out and eating and drinking, even if perhaps they are making a l'chaim for whatever reason. Do it outside of the particular prayer area of the kotel. So to summarize, we've seen some of the history of the kotel and how at various times in our history it's been possible to use it for prayer, at other times it hasn't been. We've seen different photos taking us back to 1870 and forwards as to what the Kotel area looked like, particularly the area right in front of it, how narrow it was, and how that tells us about the way and the volume of use that happened at the Kotel. We've seen what happened post-1967 when a big area was made in front of the Kotel, and the difference between the prayer area right next to the Kotel and the area behind it as well. And we've looked at some of the points in Halakha that determine whether the Kotel is to be treated like a big shul, which it is, certainly according to Rabbi Rabinovich, the Rabbi of the Kotel, and what the implications are. That a place where you don't daven on a fixed basis doesn't have sanctity, but a place where you do daven on a fixed basis certainly does. One shouldn't eat or drink there, one should act in an appropriate way. And it's the area outside and behind the prayer area of the Kotel where other things can happen that wouldn't necessarily happen in a shul. So I hope we've got a greater appreciation now about the history of the Kotel, the use of the Kotel as well, and the best ways when, please God, we should be able and fortunate enough to visit it or to look at it even online, to connect to it in the most spiritual of ways. So I wish you all a very good Yom Yerushalayim. I wish everyone, please God, safety and health, and that should be for the whole world, and a refuah shleima, a safe and complete healing for everybody that needs it. And I'd like to thank you for joining these shiurim, and I hope we'll have more to follow. Just to note that our Machzor for Yom Yerushalayim is still available until Shavuot on special offer at only £15, including P&P in the UK. If you go to the www.theus.org.uk/Machzor, you'll find it, the From Exile to Redemption Machzor, with beautiful pictures and explanations from historical figures who were there at the time for the modern days of the Sfirat HaOmer period. And also, please don't forget the Mizrahi UK and US Yom Yerushalayim Shabbaton at home, which details are coming up on the screen. It's going to be, please God, absolutely fabulous, wonderful speeches, music, great things to read. Which I hope you certainly enjoy over Shabbat, and a wonderful way to connect to Yom Yerushalayim. So thank you again for joining, and I wish you all the very best. And please God, Shalom al Yisrael, and L'Shana Ha'Ba'ah B'Yerushalayim.